Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators. And I ran this show a year and 4 months ago and only had like 900 subscribers. So I thought I would run it again, and this will come up pretty soon. But first, I want to announce that in a few hours, we're going to have our Salt Lake Expositor episode. So that's a little commercial. So let me bring this to the stage and make it big, and we'll start it. And so if you've seen this before, go ahead and scroll on. And if you haven't seen this before, it's well worth the watch, and I highly recommend it. And so let me start it now. Maven, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes. Before I bring her on, I think many people who do know her will maybe have seen her on the other show I work on, Mormon Stories. She's also been on Hidden True Crime and I think several other channels talking about her connection to the very highly publicized, especially lately, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell cases. They have both been convicted for murder and conspiracy for murder, and they have been sentenced. And so, when there's a lot of interest in true crime in general, and a lot of people who have eyes on this case. And in a way, it's good. I think it's good. The curiosity is good because I think we want to figure out how these kinds of terrible things happen so that we can know or maybe recognize if something similar is ever happening in our life, but it can also be really invasive to families. And so what we have, this is, I believe, Lori's cousin. Her name is Megan Connor. She has her own channel, and it's about kind of your starting a new life, and especially if you come from backgrounds that are traumatic. And I think it makes sense, I guess, given the family situation. So that's the start. I'm going to go ahead and bring her on, and we're going to talk about Megan's channel. Here we go.
Welcome to the show.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I forgot to name your channel, and we'll have it linked also as well. It's called the Midlife Revolution, and it's new beginnings, new starts, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about taking a look at your life and, just asking the question, is this what I want for my life? So many of us kind of get put on a treadmill at an early age, and it's important to, hit the red stop button and step off and look around and say, what would I change? What would I do differently if I were starting over? And it's about making small changes that end up sort of having a ripple effect throughout your life.
And does this start from making that decision? I think, because I'm thinking I've had definite start over moments in my life. And so there's sometimes a lead up to it. So does your channel kind of start with people who are in that spot where they're like looking forward or head to this change? Or is it more of like you've decided, or you've done this thing, or now you're divorced, or now you've moved, or whatever big thing, you've changed your job or quit one at least. And now what? Where do you feel like you kind of start there?
I think it's almost like a little bit of a how-to. I sort of take people through my journey of change and evolution in my life, and the ways in which I changed my thinking, which then changed my behavior, which then changed so many things about my life. And it started with a mental health journey, and so I go through some of those things. It really just the whole first season is all episodes of just me by myself talking about my experiences. And I called it solos. And then my next season is going to be duets. And I've started to do some of those interviews already, and they'll start to post here in the next month or so. But it's really giving people something to consider and taking the opportunity to question everything in your life and just say, is this serving me? Is it something that's healthy for me? Does this align with my long-term goals for myself?
Is there a kind of is there a particular niche that you're going for? Or I mean, when it comes to you have your I guess the situation that caused you to make the change. I don't know if it's something like, is this for divorcees or is it for faith deconstruction, because that's also a big change, or health or other things. Like, is it kind of for anybody with any change, or is there more of a focus?
Yeah, it really is. It really is for anybody with any change, to be really broad about it. But specifically, it's about anybody who's in a position where they're sort of questioning anything about their life, big or small, to say, is this really what I want? And how do I do it differently if not?
Okay.
And so it's for really, and I said this on one of my podcasts a few weeks ago, I'm constantly questioning really big things in my life, like whether or not I want to continue to live in the United States, and really small things like, are my kitchen cabinets organized in the most efficient manner for me to prepare food? So it's about all of those things, because they all impact our quality of life, our mental health, and our ability to show up in the world for the people that we care about.
And also, our show is about the creator's journey. So maybe you can begin with a little bit of your story and things that might include how that would lead up to your podcast, things that are interesting.
Yeah. What was the big change for you that got all of this going?
Yeah, so I've been through a lot of changes over the last 10 years or so. And I basically kind of had been going through life with blinders on. I was on a treadmill, and I talk about it like I was in this ether of Mormonism and my family system. And I had a wake up moment, and it caused me to start questioning everything about my life. I realized that I sort of had minimized a lot of terrible experiences in my life and abusive situations. And so I finally reached out to get therapeutic help, because I had only ever seen therapists that were associated with the LDS Church. And starting therapy without that connection is the thing that really started the big revolution, because then I had to go back and address all of the trauma that had happened to me as a child and my problematic family system and all of those things. And while I was going through that healing process, I did a lot of journaling. And when I sort of emerged as a more healthy human being, I looked around at the other people that I saw in my therapy groups and realized that there were not a lot of people who had been through what I went through as a child, who were now thriving as adults and having healthy lives. And so I decided to turn my journaling from my therapy journey into a book. So I wrote a book. It's called I Walked Through Fire to Get Here. And I started my channel as a way to start having conversations about how to do life in a healthier way, healthy parenting, and things like that. And then I started promoting my book. And then Lori's trial happened, and I started getting more exposure. And I just sort of formulated this idea of starting a podcast in the midst of that. And I didn't start my podcast. I launched it on Eclipse Day on April 8th this year. So it's pretty new. But I've got 15 episodes out there right now for the first season. And as I said, I'm working on season 2 now.
That's right.
That's awesome.
Kind of risky to start it on Eclipse Day. You might have only had one episode, and then the end of the world might have come.
That's right.
You narrowly missed. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me, and I know I said I didn't want to focus too much on Lori versus you, but I almost kind of see like a parallel here, where I think Lori was also trying to take control of her life, but the way that went was really horrific and tragic. But I imagine, and you understand, I think all of us, especially as women coming from Mormon culture, there's so little power and agency. There's a lot of, I guess, lip service given to agency, but as a woman in the church, the experience is very different. And I just think how powerful it is, and how I guess wonderful it is that you've taken this path, which is far more healthy, obviously, and you're sharing it and bringing other people into this, because I do think people get stuck sometimes or feel stuck, at least in situations they feel like they can't get out of. And I'm almost wondering if it is kind of that when you are feeling stuck or rigid, that your mind might go to more weird or creative places to try to feel some empowerment, versus the honestly hard work that you have to do to self-reflect and maybe also deal with things that you are trying not to remember anymore, from the past. That hurts. And that's a lot of hard work. I think we would all like to feel like we are goddesses and we're amazing and we have magical powers. That's one way. But honestly, it's fantasy. It's ultimately fantasy. And I think what you're doing is really not just getting yourself unstuck, but in a way that's grounded in reality and real change. And you're spreading that out to other people. So I just think that's really great. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I think it's such an important part of the conversation is, both. I think there are a lot of parallels between Lori and I think some people get like weirded out when I say that, but we're so similar. Even in our lives before all of this happened, we had very similar circumstances. And I think the important part of the conversation is, looking at the system of Mormonism and saying, I don't feel powerful in this system. And Lori's take was, how do I make it work in this system? And how do I become more powerful in this system? And my take was, maybe I'm not the problem. Maybe it's the system that's unhealthy. And maybe I can leave that system and still have a happy life. And it does require, as you were saying, Maven, that we examine the possibility that we could have been wrong about, Mormonism or whatever it is, whether it's the career we chose, or whether it's the family system we're in, or whether we're in a relationship that's not healthy, rather than changing ourselves to fit something that's unhealthy, maybe we examine the whole system, and maybe we see, that there's a different way or a different place we could belong to, or something else. And it is really hard work, because it means digging into who you are as a person, what you believe about yourself as a person. And for me personally, being told who I was all my life, or who I should be, and trying to fit myself into that little box of Mormonism. And now on the other side, out of Mormonism, realizing that there are parts of me that I silenced for such a long time because it didn't fit into the box I was trying to be put into. Instead, doing the hard work to examine all those parts of myself and accept them and love them, rather than trying to stuff them down in order to fit someone else's viewpoint or agenda, or vision of who I am.
I was thinking that sometimes this reflection, it can cover so many things, because on the one, there's things that maybe we should feel some, I guess, responsibility or accountability for. There's maybe some shame or regret involved, and those are good feelings to learn how to grapple with. I feel like in my experience also, sometimes it was some things that I was suppressing or pushing down about myself were actually good things about me. So then there was kind of that flip of, this used to be bad, but now I see it as good. And then on the other hand, there's maybe good things about you or about yourself that were never recognized or seen. And that's also been a part of my journey, and I would think would be an important part. And maybe it gets kind of neglected a little bit in this kind of stuff, because I think we do tend to focus on the cognitive dissonance and the responsibility, accountability part, because I think we're more motivated by pain in our life than the good times. So I guess it makes sense to, and we need to do it. It's important, crucial work, and people who aren't able to do this are really fundamentally damaged in ways that if they cannot be able to really look at themselves and look at mistakes, they often are not ever able to really heal. But on the other hand, yeah, it just occurred to me that there's also a lot in learning to appreciate yourself, like you said, like not just love who you are, as in like, I'm loving this imperfect thing about me, I'm loving this thing that I used to hate about myself, or this thing that still maybe bothers me, but I'm accepting it. But also learning to love and recognize the good things about you and the good things you have to offer the world. So that might be a piece missing if this part is really difficult for people, or if it just feels like it's all about the bad and every mistake I've ever made and just how stupid or regretful I feel now in this moment. Maybe that could be part of the grace, I guess. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very easy for all of us to get stuck somewhere in the grief cycle, because all of these things bring up grief. I think it's the emotion that I feel more than anything else in my life is grief over loss, or grief over shame, or grief over mistakes, or things like that. And I think a lot of people just get stuck in that cycle, and they're not, if you don't process, the shame part of it and all of that goes along with it, it's really easy to stay stuck in that for a long time. And I've seen and observed a lot of people exiting Mormonism or other unhealthy systems, and they are so focused on what they lost by belonging to that system that they stay stuck there, just revisiting those losses rather than processing it and moving forward. We sort of have that sunk cost fallacy that, like, I spent so much time in that system that I need to figure out how to get those years back, or how to get that time back, or how to rewrite the past or whatever. And we can't do it. The only way that we really get to move past it is the radical acceptance that, yes, I lost that time and it's gone, and there's nothing I can do to get it back. And here's how I move forward. I have to process the grief of it and then move on. The not processing every emotion about it is what keeps us stuck, I think.
Makes sense.
I think also, like, there's, for women in particular, you're talking about now you can, be more, right? But there's a scripture, don't hide your light under a bushel, right? For men, the sky's the limit. But for women, it's what? Ward chorister, Relief Society president, bishop's wife.
Mm-hmm.
That's like it. And so now those things aren't there anymore. Now you have the sky's the limit.
Yeah. And I think it's always so interesting to me to contemplate that even the highest ranking woman in the LDS church, which would arguably be, I guess, the General Relief Society president, is outranked by her 8-year-old grandson or her 12-year-old grandson who just became a deacon, and not that we were always told, well, don't aspire to positions in the church or whatever. But for me, it was more, I didn't aspire to have a leadership position. I aspired to be able to help people and to be able to, teach people. And I taught gospel doctrine in my ward for something like 6 or 7 years. And that was pretty much the most influence I could have over people in my ward for good, just to be a positive influence. And, to be able to share my story of how I came out of the system that I came out of, or systems, I should say. I wouldn't be able to really do that effectively, to share that message with people in a, faithful way, because, gospel doctrine teacher has a platform that is very, you stick to this little manual or whatever. And I think when we get programmed that we're secondary as women in the church, we do sort of come out of that. And some of us realize, oh, now the sky is the limit. Now I really can have more influence for good in the world. And I don't have to check with somebody else in order to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I realized like it's not so much about power as in power over other people, which is part of the conversation around priesthood in the Mormon church, because that's where that's where all authority comes from. And so they like to say that we have influence, and that's a word used a few times here. We have influence, but generally still no actual voice. We don't have a seat at the table when it comes to policy, when it comes to what happens in the church and for members. And when I feel like when the priesthood is talked about in general in lessons about why it's important and why it was restored to the earth, it's talked about as in all these positive terms as God, the power and authority from God to do saving ordinances, like baptism or give priesthood blessings that supposedly heal the sick, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to talking about women getting the priesthood, that's when it's all about, power per se. And I've always just thought that that's really unfair. But so when we are coming out of these systems, when we talk about like gaining power, I mean, a lot of times it's really starting from like our own body and mind. It's literally in our own sphere. And I'm not even talking about whole, like your home and your relationships and stuff, but really actually starting to have control, like real full control of ourselves and our choices for the first time, and then going beyond there. And not everybody wants to or has to like be an influence to the world. It could be just in your home and just who you are as an authentic person. That changes how your family sees you, your other relationships, your children, your friends, and all of that is positive too. But even if you didn't have a positive effect on anyone else, I think it's worth it for at least what you get for yourself. So those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that
Or
self-empowerment and the ability to affect positive change in your own life and, hopefully in the lives of your loved ones, the people you care about, and to not, for me, it always came back to, if you wanted to change some kind of a policy in the church, you had to check with somebody. You had to check with the priesthood leader. You couldn't do that even for your own women's organization. So not having to check in with somebody else and, just having that self-empowerment. So important.
what do you think is are you seeing the biggest obstacle or for people who do watch your show and are commenting and relating with you, where are they usually stuck at the most or asking about the most?
I think there's still a lot of stigma around getting mental health help, getting therapy, going to therapy. And I think a lot of people don't really know how to start that process and don't really understand what it means to find a therapist that specializes in the particular things that you need help with. And so a lot of my live conversations, which I have pretty much twice a week, center around those kinds of concepts and helping people to recognize that we all have unhealed emotional wounds and we all need therapeutic help to get through those wounds, to process that trauma. All trauma is a wound, and we all have some kind of a wound in that way. And what happens is when we don't address the wound and heal it, we end up acting out in dysfunctional ways. And ultimately that harms us personally because we develop unhealthy beliefs about ourselves. And it harms the people that we interact with because we develop unhealthy relational habits. And so a lot of our conversations on my channel have to do with that. I have a free how to hire a therapist guide on my website. And as part of my coaching, I offer to take somebody from start to finish in finding a therapist that works for them, because I think that's difficult for a lot of people.
That's really good.
And
Yeah.
so to get the timeline exactly right, did you start journaling before you saw a therapist, or did seeing a therapist cause you to start journaling? And then at what point did your journaling make you think you should write books?
Well, I always wrote as a kid. I fell in love with creative writing in high school. I had an excellent creative writing teacher who I still keep in touch with on Facebook a little bit. And but when I was a child, a youth, and a young adult, all of my writing was escapist and fiction because my life was so horrible that I always wanted to get away from it. And when I started therapy, I realized that just to get my thoughts out of my head and stop ruminating and perseverating about my feelings, I needed to write them down. And writing them down helped me to move on rather than continuing this thought loop. And I did a lot of journaling through how I felt about things, but also that helped me to get back in touch with reality because my coping mechanism was dissociation. I pretended that things were not as bad as they were, or I said to myself, well, that happened so long ago and I should just get over it. So the journaling sort of evolved through my therapeutic journey. And the reason that I turned it into a book is because I wanted it to be something where people could look at it and say, okay, this is how she changed her mind about this. And this is how she decided to do this healing modality. And I talk in my book about different healing modalities, and I talk about different strategies that I use during my therapeutic process and how I literally got from the point where I wanted to die until now, where I have a happy life.
That's really powerful. I want to send, so we're gonna definitely send people to your channel. I'm thinking of what you said earlier about solos versus duets and having people on, because I was thinking normally we want to try to get more viewers and watchers who need the content to the channel, but I'm also thinking you might be open for guests and guest stories to help you with the content. Is that where you're at also? And if so, what kind of guests or stories are you looking for? What kind of collaborations
Yeah,
in the future?
definitely. Yeah, definitely. I'm looking for guests, and I want to have people on my channel who are revolutionaries because I consider myself and the people that are making these huge changes in their lives to be revolutionaries. And so one of my first guests that I had on just a couple weeks ago was Tommy Johnson. He's also an ex-Mormon creator you probably have seen on TikTok and Instagram as the Tomsters. And June
Sure.
is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. And I wanted to have him on to have a conversation about what it was like to be a man in the LDS church and the difficulties that you go through in the expectations that people have. So we had a really great 2-hour conversation about that. And then I also just recorded an episode with John Larson, who I consider to be a revolutionary who just uprooted his life and started the Dabbler Farm. So people who have made changes, whether they're big or small, that have gone on to affect their lives in profound ways.
That's good to know. So if you, I know when you say it that way, I feel like some people will be like, well, I'm not a revolutionary exactly, but I think there's probably a lot of people who do have really good stories, really interesting things to tell. So
Yeah.
if you've gone through something and you've learned from it, I recommend contacting Megan
Or
and seeing if it's something that would be good for the show.
if you're a viewer and you know of somebody, you could recommend them to Megan.
Perfect.
Yeah. I always
Um,
love to have conversations with people about the changes that they're making in their lives. And even if they're small and they seem inconsequential, these little changes really do have a ripple effect. And people, I think the audience in general needs to see more examples of people questioning things and changing things in their lives and sort of getting rid of dogma and expectations that were ingrained in us from a young age. So.
Perfect. Are there any final things you want to share or have viewers know about your channel? Yeah, go ahead,
Leading
Gene.
into that, there's one thing because you wrote your book and all of a sudden the Valo Daybell things happen, but you're thinking that you're going to promote your book and you go on shows maybe and you talk about your book and then all of a sudden the course changes. Is going on everybody's podcast make you feel like you could do it too, or that you see the impact and that is a better way of getting your message out? Or what was the thought process there?
Great question.
Well, I actually started my channel while I was still in the process of writing my book. And by channel, I'll say Instagram. I was getting on Instagram and TikTok, just talking about conversations of healthier relationships and things like that. And during that process, finished writing my book and started getting it published and started getting out there and talking to people about that, the healing and the book and everything. And then suddenly started talking about Lori's case. But the reason I started talking about Lori's case is because I didn't follow all of the media after she got arrested, because it was a lot of speculation, sensationalism, and I didn't really want to participate in that conversation. And I didn't want to show up just for the shock value of having a family member spill tea. I didn't think that that was a useful conversation. But right before her trial started, I saw a video where somebody, it was, I don't know, just this whole conversation around, she was such a great mom. She was the cupcake mom. She was the primary chorister. She was, she was such a wonderful human being. And that was not my experience with her. And so everybody saw this side to her and said, she must have met Chad Daybell and then just snapped. And I said, no, there were things present in her personality from the time we were teenagers that were red flags and warning signs. And there was a long lead up to this. And I wanted to start the conversation that there was an unhealthy family system that she grew up in, married with an unhealthy religious system. And those two things together started this ball rolling. So I wanted to have those conversations. And that was the whole reason I started talking about the case in the first place. And so it is a marriage between what I was already talking about and what was happening and playing out in the media. And so what I always come back to, even when I do interviews about Lori, is that we all know somebody in our lives who is manipulative, whose relational habits are dysfunctional, who will lie to get something that they want. We all know people like that. Here's how to identify those traits, and here's how to address them and try to start holding people accountable for that kind of behavior rather than just dismissing it or allowing it to continue, because it snowballs and people get hurt. So
I've noticed with manipulative and toxic people, sometimes because they're always that way, it can be really exhausting to push back against. And that's something that I've seen a lot, where it's just like, keep the peace, or that's just how they are, just, maybe roll your eyes and move on. But that can still also enable the continuation of that behavior when you're constantly caving in because it's not worth a fight, with them. And, we can see what happens when they need that resistance, but they're not going to change. Maybe they maybe always be a toxic person, but not necessarily. But still, just letting it go. I guess this case shows what the worst that can happen is. So.
Right. Exactly.
That's right. It was really interesting that you used sort of like the lens of Lori's situation to explain a larger problem. And so that's something that probably will maybe hopefully mark you as somebody brave enough to go and do that and to appear on your Mormon Stories. And I know that you mentioned that you're in a different space now than even a year ago on Mormon Stories. And how would you sort of categorize how different things are for you now?
Well, I've done a lot of deconstruction since then. When I went on Mormon Stories, I think it was May 1st of last year, and I had just freshly left the church. I was disaffected with the church for a long time, starting with the November 2015 policy, and tried really hard to make it work with the cognitive dissonance that I was feeling for a lot of years.
Just real quick, if we have viewers that don't know, the 2015 policy was one that the church implemented, basically banning children of gay members of the church, or whose parents, even if they were not members of the church or were disaffected or excommunicated or anything, if they had a gay parent that was in a homosexual relationship, then these children were not allowed to be baptized or do any of the other priesthood advancements for the boys. Yeah. So sorry, quick side note to that. So that was kind of where it started for you, and then moving forward from there.
Yeah. And then, during the pandemic, I was able to, that was a great step away for me to examine things from the outside. But it took me a long time. The conclusions I kept coming to was like, Mormonism is super unhealthy, but it's true. So I guess I just don't fit, and God will figure it out later. Right. And I was in that space until I wrote the chapter in my book that had to do with Mormonism. And I reread that chapter in advance of publishing the book. And I gave it to my partner, Samuel, who's never been Mormon. And I said, have I said everything that I need to say in this chapter? And Mormonism absolutely infuriates Samuel. And so he got very angry when he read it, because it was very apologetic of the church. It was very much this stance of like, this is what they present as the truth, and I just don't fit because I'm not that person.
And this must be what God wants. This is how God wants it.
Right. If God wants it this way, I guess there's something I don't understand yet, and we'll figure it out when this life is over. And God knows my heart. I'm faithful. He's not going to leave me behind just because of who I really am. And so, I got to that point, and Samuel was like, no, you can't say these things. Like, this is just awful. You have to dig in and expose the church for what it is. And so I started doing some research, because I wanted to know where we got it wrong, you know. And that's what started my deconstruction process. And it was kind of like a 3 or 4 day rabbit hole that I went down. And when I came up, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I resigned. And that was just February. And so I was very early in my deconstruction process when I went on Mormon Stories. And now, a year later, I deconstructed everything all the way down to nihilism. And I was in nihilism for a while before I was able to kind of start rebuilding my spirituality for myself and making those choices for myself. And in deciding to start my podcast, there was a moment where it was like, well, do I want to be a quote unquote ex-Mormon creator and talk about Mormonism? And ultimately, after meditating and journaling about that, I said, no, that's not where I want to live. I'm beyond that now. And yes, I'm going to talk about it. And yes, I'm going to support the ex-Mormon community. And yes, I'm going to identify always as somebody who is a former member. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life talking about what an unhealthy system that is and examining it and saying, oh, look, the crazies are doing crazy things again. Who's surprised by that? You know, what I wanted to do was start a conversation about an avenue forward for people to heal. And I think the healing process is a lifelong process. And I think that's a much more important conversation to have, is like, how do we move forward? How do we change? How do we start a new conversation and tell a new story?
You've actually created like a whole new category. You're an ex-Mormon ally of ex-Mormons.
Right.
There you go. I think any final thoughts or things to share, any final questions, Jean? All right. I think this is a good place to wrap up. And I think we can also have Megan back on in the future, probably, to talk about more of these kinds of things. And I'm very curious to see how the channel goes and the guests you get on. So yeah, looking forward to that. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for your support and help and participation. And we'll see you next. Oh, I got to like and subscribe below, and we'll see you next time on Ladder Daily Digest. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Well, there you go. I don't know why I'm not on screen. There you go. So I'm drinking my ginger tea, trying to get better. Thanks everybody for watching. Share, like, and subscribe. And see you this afternoon on the Salt Lake Expositor. Bye-bye.